Hi there, I'm back. It's the same afternoon as the Mountain of Camphor, and I thought I would go on to chapter 5. I feel like the way that this book is set up is we have the fruit of the Spirit and then a chapter that has to do with how to put that fruit of the Spirit into practice. So, since I did joy this morning, then I thought that this evening or this afternoon we would read chapter 5, which is entitled Bitterness and Murmuring. We are in the book The Mountains of Spices by Hannah Hurnard, chapter 5. Some days after the events described in the last chapters, Bitterness and his wife Murmuring were sitting together in their private room at the back of the inn eating their midday meal. Something seemed to be troubling the thoughts of both of them, but for a little while neither mentioned it. Bitterness ate in complete silence, and his wife busied herself looking after the wants of their 3 children. Young Grumble, the son and heir, and his twin sisters, Little Sob and Drizzle, who, with bibs tied round their necks, were banging their spoons on their high chairs and vociferously demanding attention. Murmuring dressed all her children daintily and was quite rightly proud of their appearance and good looks. But even at that early age, all 3 were loud in their complaints if what they demanded was not instantly forthcoming. At last, Murmuring, as if unable to remain silent any longer, turned to her husband and asked angrily, "Well, Bitterness, what do you say to these constant visits of the shepherdess Spiteful and her sister in the attic upstairs?" Bitterness did not answer, but went on eating in gloomy silence. "Well," snapped his wife again, "did you hear what I said? Or have you suddenly gone deaf?" One could see at once from whom dear Little Sob and Drizzle had inherited their determined manner of gaining the attention they wanted. Bitterness spoke at last. "I suppose there is no harm in them," he said shortly. "Oh, you do you?" answered his wife stormily. "Well, let me tell you that if it gets about in the valley that the shepherd visits here, and there is the possibility of meeting him, all our clientele will fall away, and the business will be ruined. Everybody hates him." "There's no likelihood of people meeting him," said Bitterness. "He does not force himself on anyone." "People will begin to talk about us," retorted Murmuring. "They will suggest that we are coming under his influence. I tell you I don't like it. We have had enough trouble already. Just think of the way he persuaded your cousin Much Afraid to leave everything and go off to the mountains, and how disgusted all your connections were. We cannot afford to bring ourselves under suspicion." Bitterness paused for a moment before he answered. Then he said in a low voice, "I do not see how anyone can deny that it turned out to be the most fortunate thing for my cousin that she did go with him. I must admit, I think she is to be envied." "Indeed!" exclaimed his wife, her cheeks flushing hotter with anger every moment. "I seem to remember that you and others went after the said fortunate cousin in order to try to bring her back, and I believe she was charming enough to stone you, and was the cause also of her cousin Pride's being crippled for life." A slow flush rose on her husband's cheeks also, but there was no change in his voice as he answered quietly, "It's quite true. but we were trying to kidnap her by force, and was her only means, and it was her only means of self-defense. When I think of her situation now, and what it would have been if we had succeeded in turning her back and forcing her to marry Craven Fear, I cannot help feeling that she is one of the most fortunate people in the world. He paused a moment, and then, raising his voice slightly, he added, if the shepherd can do the same sort of thing for that poor, broken-hearted woman upstairs, I, for one, am not going to try to prevent it. His wife glared at him angrily, but not exactly as though she were surprised to find him take this point of view. What has come over you? She demanded after a pause. You have never been the same since you came back from that journey to the mountains and your unsuccessful attempt to make Much-Afraid return. Her husband went on eating with his eyes fixed on his plate, and then answered in an even lower tone, you are right. I am not the same. Murmuring looked startled and a little nonplussed. Then she rallied and went back to the main point. Well, I tell you, Bitterness, and mark my words, for they will certainly come true, if you let the shepherd continue to visit Spiteful here in this house, our business will be ruined. Absolutely ruined. For the first time her husband raised his head and looked straight in her face, and his eyes dark with bitterness and with some other emotion which she could not define. Sometimes, said he slowly and painfully, sometimes I think that I would not care if the business were ruined, if only we could get rid of the cursed thing altogether. Mrs. Bitterness gasped with horror, and then said in a tone pregnant with wrath and accusation, You've been talking with the shepherd yourself, Bitterness? He nodded without speaking. Sneaking up to that attic too? Exploded his wife furiously. You would do a thing like that, putting yourself under the influence of that man, letting him twist you round his little finger, till you actually want to take the food out of the mouths of your own helpless little children. There you sit, she went on hysterically, actually telling me that you wouldn't mind if the business were ruined? Our hotel, the most prosperous and well-conducted inn in the whole valley? I wonder you don't choke on the words. Listen, Murmuring, said her husband, as though suddenly deciding to speak frankly and fully. Listen to me. What sort of business is this, really? Ask yourself honestly. You say it is respectable as well as profitable. Do you really believe that? Look at the fruits of the business. Look at the fruits of the business, Murmuring. Look at your own poor, demoralized brother Moody. If it were not for our respectable bar, would he be where he is now, in jail for half killing his wife? Consider that poor girl upstairs, not only deprived of her child, but probably also of the joy of becoming a mother for the rest of her life. Look at our own children, Murmuring, and put yourself in her place. Then he went on without waiting for a reply, and his voice shook with emotion or pain. And look at my cousin Craven Fear. Poor thing, also in prison for assault and disorderly behavior while under the influence of drink, which he likewise obtained in our respectable bar room. Craven Fear was always a bully, interpolated his wife hastily. It was not just that once. He has got what's coming to him for a long time. Exactly, agreed her husband in a heavy voice. but his outbreaks of bullying were always when he was the worse for drink. Craven Fear has been drinking in this respectable bar room of ours ever since he left school, and he was sneaking drinks long before that. And you know it. His wife was silent. And then think of the effect on our own children, went on Bitterness in a voice that trembled. That is what shakes me. That still comes nearer home. What if they follow on in the same way and come under the same curse? Do you wonder, Murmuring, that I have been feeling that it would be a relief if we could get away from the business altogether? His words seemed only to rouse her to greater fury. If that it's all the doing of the shepherd, she exclaimed, almost choking with anger. It's the shepherd who has put these thoughts into your head. What else has he been saying to you? Tell me. He said, answered her husband slowly, that we shall never know real peace and happiness, or indeed real prosperity, until we give up this business altogether. I knew it! Cried his wife furiously. It is just what he would say. Give up everything that we have worked and toiled for. Give the money we have honestly earned, just when at last we have succeeded in getting wealthy, and now own one of the most prosperous business concerns in the valley. And what, pray, does he offer you in return? He will take us into his service, answered her husband in a low tone. Make us shepherds? Shepherds! Mrs. Bitterness almost choked on the words. And give us a 4-room cottage and a cat and a dog and some chickens? Bah! As she spoke, Murmuring looked out of the window and surveyed the domain over which she ruled so competently and with such undisputed sway. She looked at the well-filled flower garden, the clipped hedges of the bowling green, at the river and the gaily colored boats. Down the passage, through the half-open door, she could hear the clink of glasses in the bar-room and the sound of voices and occasional laughter. She could distinguish the genial tones of the new bartender, a capable and experienced man named Sharp. Quite different, luckily, from that weak boy, Moody. She could hear the girls in the kitchen laughing together as they ate their early meal in preparation for the busy midday hour, and she visualized the parking place filled with cars and motorcycles. All these things they had achieved by sheer hard work and competence, for no one could deny, thought Murmuring complacently, that they were a smart and competent couple. And within the few years since their marriage had transformed the shabby old pub, which Bitterness had inherited from his father, into this attractive, modern, and extremely well-patronized hotel. And now, here was her husband, actually mad enough, under the influence of that utterly impossible shepherd, to suggest that they would ever know peace and happiness and prosperity until they gave it all up, until they sank to the position of hired shepherds. It was madness. It was abominable folly. It was worse. She looked at her husband, at his sad, miserable face, at the strange new pain and unrest in his eyes, and for a moment her heart quailed at the fearful possibility of losing her kingdom altogether. Then she rallied her forces and determined that she would not surrender any part of it. She reminded herself that she was the stronger of the two, and with her lay the power to prevent such a catastrophe. So she forced to laugh, as though suddenly she was amused by the whole thing and chose to treat his words as a joke. Your poor shepherd, said she. He certainly is a crank and fanatic if ever there was one. but he will find that his weird ideas do not go down here. I fear if he tries to come forcing his way in here, that he will get much the same reception that I saw him receive at Mrs. Dismal Foreboding's cottage this morning." Her husband said nothing, so she went on laughing heartily as she spoke. "I was walking along the village street when I saw good Mrs. Valiant, with her shepherd in tow, open the garden gate of Mrs. Dismal's cottage and go and knock on the door. I was a little curious to see what would happen, so I waited. And what do you think? The door was opened an inch or two, and there was Mrs. Dismal wearing the most awful old brown wrapper you ever saw. Mrs. Valiant didn't seem to notice her embarrassment, but just called out in her exasperatingly cheery way, 'Here he is, Dismal dear,' and tried to push inside, and poor old Mrs. Dismal gave a kind of squawk and jabbered. 'Can't you see I'm not fit to receive anyone like this?' and slammed the door right in his face. He won't go calling there again in a hurry. I thought I would make myself ill with laughing." The memory of it seemed to have the same dangerous effect upon her, for she nearly choked with mirth again. While she was still laughing and mopping her eyes, suddenly a quiet voice spoke through the half-open door behind her. "May I come in? I would like to speak with you." And there was the shepherd himself. Now it was one thing to mock the shepherd behind his back, but quite another thing to be confronted with him face to face. There was something so regal and commanding in his manner that it had an overawing effect. In an instant, bitterness had sprung to his feet and pushed forward the best armchair, and though his face was dark and miserable, there was a suppressed eagerness in his manner, as if this visit were not really unwelcome. As for Murmuring, her laughter ceased, and the contemptuous expression on her face vanished, as if by magic. And she heard herself saying to the visitor she had just labeled as a crank and a fanatic, and in whose face she had threatened to slam the door, "Please be seated, sir. May we offer you some refreshment?" He shook his head, but seated himself in the armchair and then said quietly to Bitterness, "Friend, have you been considering what I said to you when we last met?" "Yes," said Bitterness in a strange, low voice, so unlike his usual loud, harsh tones. "Yes, my wife and I were just discussing it together just now." The heart of Mrs. Bitterness quailed within her, but she was absolutely determined to resist the shepherd's influence over her husband, and to see that he did not make her lose the kingdom on which her heart was set. For the moment she said nothing, but with all the strength of her will rallied every power which she possessed to resist him to the utmost. Against her will, however, she raised her eyes and looked across at the shepherd, and saw that he was gazing straight at her, as though he could read her thoughts as plainly as if she had spoken them aloud. But there was a look of compassionate pity on his face which surprised her, and in some dreadful way seemed almost as though it would break through her defenses. She said nothing, but rallied her powers of resistance still more desperately. "It is hard for a rich person to enter into the kingdom of love," said the shepherd, speaking directly to her. "Why so?" asked Mrs. Bitterness stubbornly, folding her lips together as tightly as possible. "Because one cannot love God and wealth too," said the shepherd. "It simply cannot be done." "If you will excuse me, sir," said Mrs. Bitterness coldly, "I must tell you that I cannot justly be accused of not loving God. I attend church faithfully, whenever the business permits it. We contribute more generously than most people do to the charities which we consider to be deserving, and all my little children have been properly baptized. As for loving my neighbors myself, which I suppose you will quote at me next, no one, I am sure, can possibly accuse me of injustice, or meanness, or unkindness to anyone, and I do not know of anything which my Maker can justly condemn me for. Indeed, the very fact that our business has prospered makes it possible for my husband and myself to give far more generously to needy charities than we were able to do before. I repeat, I believe you to be mistaken in saying that one cannot love one's Maker and one's neighbor and wealth at the same time. You do not love that poor girl upstairs in the attic, said the shepherd as quietly and as gently as possible. A deep, angry flush rose in Murmuring's cheeks. "What has she been saying against me?" she asked through tightly compressed lips. "Nothing at all," said the shepherd, still very quietly. But as he spoke, his eyes strayed round the comfortable, airy room in which they were sitting and rested on the well-filled table. "I cannot help seeing that if you loved her as yourself, she would not be lying up there in that scorching attic, weak and ill as she is, subsisting on bread and tea and any little extras which are provided for her through the kindness of others." The flush of Murmuring's face was even deeper as she answered, "She has been lying there for months, unable to do her work, and yet I have not turned her out of my house or asked for rent. Am I expected to feed her like a princess while she lies there idle, and have all the expense of hiring another person to do the work of her shameless husband, who has brought disgrace on our home?" "You know the answer to those questions yourself," said the shepherd, and this time his voice was stern, almost terrifyingly so, but it softened again as he added, "And I repeat, it is hard for a rich person to know anything about real love." "And so," cried Murmuring passionately, "and so you come here with the demand that we throw it all away, everything we have worked for and gained through our own industry and toil?" "Yes," said the shepherd, rising to his feet. "Yes, Murmuring, cast it all away. It is damning you. It is hardening your heart. It is poisoning you through and through. Cast it away. For what shall it profit you if you gain the whole world and lose your own soul?" "I won't," said Murmuring, suddenly losing control of herself and stamping her foot. "I won't. I tell you, nothing on earth shall allow you to take away from us that which is rightly ours. Nothing at all," she repeated fiercely. "All this belongs to me, and you shall never take it from me." The pity and compassion in his face and the stubborn fury in hers were a sight to see. "I must tell you, Murmuring," said the shepherd in a quiet, compassionate tones, "before I leave, I must tell you that if you will not learn how the utter futility and uselessness of setting your heart on earthly riches, you will have to learn it in some other and harder way. For how can I leave you," he added almost under his breath, "bound as a helpless, miserable slave to your money and possessions, when you were made for the liberty and joy of love?" Then he looked straight across the room at her husband, who all this time had stood silent with his eyes fastened fearfully and yet entreatingly on the shepherd's face, and said, "Bittermiss, come you after me?" He then turned and walked out of the room. Bitterness took one step after him. Then his wife caught hold of him weeping hysterically, clinging to him with all her might. "Don't go!" she shrieked. "Think of your children. Think of me. You will lose everything. He demands all." Her husband stood still, leaned his head against the wall, and groaned as though in agony. "It is too hard," muttered the poor rich man desperately. "It is so hard that it is impossible." Back through the doorway came the clear, gentle, and yet challenging voice of the shepherd saying, "With men it is impossible, but with God all things are possible." Then there was the sound of retreating footsteps and the closing of a door. Outside in the village street, Mrs. Valiant caught sight of the shepherd as he left the inn, and she hurried toward him eagerly. "Oh," she exclaimed, "there you are. Please, please come with me. Ever since she slammed the door in your face this morning, poor Mrs. Dismal has been like a demented creature. She is afraid you will never go near her again, that she has lost all hope of having your help, and that after such a rebuff you will certainly leave her to her misery. Oh, please come now, at once." He strode along her side down the quiet street, and they entered the miserable, weed-filled garden round the cottage of Mrs. Dismal Forebodings. Then the shepherd lifted his hand and knocked at the closed door. It opened slightly, and the white, miserable face of Mrs. Dismal peeped forth furtively. When she saw that the shepherd, she seemed to shrink back as though expecting a blow. He waited without speaking, simply looking at her, and at last Mrs. Dismal Forebodings, trembling from head to foot, pulled open the door a little wider, and the shepherd stepped inside. Having seen what happened, Mrs. Valiant, motherly, cheerful Mrs. Valiant, turned and literally ran back down the village street as though she had suddenly gone mad. She rushed in through the door of the inn and back up the stairs, and without even pausing to knock, she burst into the attic where Gloomy and Spiteful were working together on the great basket of mending. They looked up in astonishment at the door as the door flew open, and Mrs. Valiant stood before them, laughing and crying and panting for breath. Your mother," she gasped, and for a moment could say no more. Then, in a burst of joy and tears together, she brought out her glorious news. "Your mother," she said, "has just taken the shepherd into her cottage." And that is the end of chapter 5. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May he make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and grant you his peace.